The morning Alice Sutton walked into Millhaven, Kansas with nothing but 43 cents, a battered carpetbag, and a fierce refusal to beg. The whole town knew something was about to change. They just did not know what. It was the late summer of 1878, and the prairie sun pressed down on the flat earth like a branding iron on hide, relentless and unforgiving. Millhaven sat at the junction of two wagon roads, a scattering of sun-bleached buildings that included a general store, a livery, a saloon called the Copper Horn, a tiny church no one visited with enough regularity to keep the minister employed full-time, and a land office that doubled as a telegraph station on Thursdays. The town was not much to look at, but it was alive, and Alice needed alive. She had come 63 miles on foot and by the charity of a farm wagon whose driver, an elderly Mennonite named Gerber, had let her ride the last stretch in exchange for minding his chickens. She was 24 years old, lean from hunger, sunburned across her nose and cheekbones, and carrying a grief in her chest so heavy it sometimes felt like it might crack her ribs from the inside. Her mother had died of fever back in Missouri that spring. Her father had died the winter before that, crushed beneath a fallen oak while clearing timber. The small plot of land they had sharecropped did not belong to any of the Suttons, and the landowner had made it plain within a week of her mother's burial that Alice had no claim to stay. She had packed what she could carry, sewn her remaining money into the hem of her skirt, and walked west, because west was what people did in 1878 when they had nothing and needed something. She stood on the main road in Millhaven, squinting against the light, and read a notice pinned to the post outside the general store. It had been written in a large, deliberate hand on brown paper, the letters slightly uneven as though the man who wrote them was more accustomed to holding a plow handle than a pen. Harvest hands wanted. Good WAGES paid. HOLLOWAY farm. 3 miles north on the Cedar Creek Road. Ask for Roscoe. Alice read the notice twice. She was not a farmer's daughter for nothing. She knew wheat from rye, knew how to use a scythe, knew the difference between a good harvest and a ruined one, and she was not too proud to do what needed to be done. She pulled the paper off the post, tucked it into her bag, and asked a passing woman where Cedar Creek Road began. The woman, round-faced, wearing a sunbonnet, looked Alice up and down with the particular frankness of small-town women who have decided that frankness is simply efficiency. "You heading to Holloway's place?" "If he's hiring," Alice said. "He's hiring," the woman said. "Lost 2 hands to a better offer last week and he's in a state about it. But I'll warn you, Roscoe Holloway is a man of few words and a great many expectations." "I have few words myself," Alice said, "and I can meet expectations." The woman studied her another moment, then nodded once, as if she had made a private decision and found it satisfactory. "Cedar Creek Road starts just past the livery. You cannot miss the Holloway place. It's the one with the red barn." 3 miles in the August heat was not nothing, but Alice walked them the same way she had walked the last 63, 1 foot in front of the other, jaw set, eyes on what was ahead. The land opened up as she left town, and it was something, she admitted to herself, to see the great flat Kansas sky spread above the prairie without so much as a hill to interrupt it. The wheat fields on either side of the road had already been partly cut, the golden rows lying in loose windrows, and she could hear, even from the road, the distant rhythm of work, the swing and fall of blades, the low conversation of hired men, the occasional call of a voice. The red barn announced itself before the house did, gleaming like something painted fresh, which struck her as interesting. A man who painted his barn regular was a man who cared about what he owned. The house itself was a solid 2-story frame structure with a covered porch running the full length of the front. It was not fancy, but it was sound. The yard was clean. There were chickens in a proper pen, a kitchen garden set behind a low fence, and a windmill that turned slow and steady in the afternoon breeze. A border collie came loping toward her from the barn, tail up but not barking, which Alice considered a good sign. She knocked at the door of the house first because that was what you did. No answer came. She went around to the backyard and found a woman in her 60s hanging laundry, gray-braided and aproned. She looked at Alice with the same direct assessment the woman in town had offered. "Help you?" she said. "I'm looking for Roscoe Holloway. I saw the notice about harvest work." The woman pinned a shirt to the line with 2 clothespins before she spoke again. "Mabel Prout," she said. "I cook for Mr. Holloway and mind the house. He's out in the north field. You can walk through the barnyard and follow the fence line. You'll hear him before you see him." Alice thanked her and did exactly that. The barnyard smelled of horses and hay, and the particular warm animal smell of hard work conducted honestly. She followed the fence line north through cut stubble that scratched at her ankles through her boots, and she heard him before she saw him, just as Mabel had promised, not shouting, but talking, the low, steady voice of a man directing men who knew their business. Roscoe Holloway was standing at the edge of the uncut wheat, one hand on his hip and the other holding his hat, while he raked a hand through dark hair that was damp with sweat. He was 31 years old, broad-shouldered, with the kind of face that the sun and wind had shaped into something honest and angular. A strong jaw, deep-set gray eyes the color of the morning sky before the heat came, and a mouth that looked like it did not smile easily but would mean it when it did. He wore a faded blue work shirt with the sleeves rolled past his elbows, canvas trousers, and boots that had seen significant acreage. He was not the handsomest man Alice had ever seen, but there was something about him that held the eye, a quality of stillness beneath the work, as though he were rooted to this piece of earth the same way his wheat was. He spotted her coming across the stubble and watched her approach without changing his expression. "Mr. Holloway," she said, stopping a few feet away and holding her ground squarely. "I'm Alice Sutton. I saw your notice in town. I'm looking for harvest work and I can do it." He looked at her the way he might look at a piece of harness that needed assessment, not unkind but thorough. "You done harvest work before?" "My whole life," she said. "Missouri, wheat, corn, and sorghum. I can scythe, I can rake, I can stook, and I can help with the thrashing. I'm not afraid of hard work and I won't slow your crew down." He put his hat back on. The 3 men working behind him had stopped to watch with obvious interest, and he turned his head slightly and gave them a look that sent them back to their work without a word being spoken. "I pay 75 cents a day," he said. "Meals included. You'd bunk in the room off the kitchen. Mabel's got the space. Work starts at first light and goes till the light's gone." "That's fair," she said. "You need to start today. I'd prefer it." He looked at her again, and she met his gaze without looking away, because she had learned that looking away cost you things you could not afford to lose. "All right, Miss Sutton," he said. "Get your things settled with Mabel. We'll get you a scythe after supper tonight and you can start fresh at first light." "Thank you," she said. He nodded, and that was the beginning of it. Mabel Prout turned out to be as no-nonsense as her laundry hanging had suggested, but she was not unfriendly. She showed Alice a small room at the back of the kitchen that had a narrow iron bed, a washstand, a mirror no bigger than a book, and 2 pegs on the wall. It smelled of dried herbs and beeswax, and after the open prairie it felt like a luxury. "Supper's at 7, Mabel said. "Breakfast is at 5. Don't be late to either one. Mr. Holloway sets the table by the clock and he'll not hold it for lateness." "I won't be late," Alice said. Mabel looked at her the way she had looked at her before, but something had softened very slightly in her expression. "You're thin," she said, which was both an observation and a judgment. "I've been traveling," Alice said simply. Mabel turned without another word and went back to the kitchen, and 20 minutes later there was a plate of cold cornbread and a jar of cold milk left on the washstand outside Alice's door. Alice ate every bite of it standing up, and was grateful in the unsentimental way that genuine hunger produces. Supper that evening was eaten at a long kitchen table, Roscoe at the head, Alice and the 3 hired hands along the sides, Mabel moving between the stove and the table, with the practiced efficiency of a woman who had fed working men for decades. The hired hands were a pair of brothers named Dale and Curtis Webb from somewhere in Nebraska, and a quiet young man named Henry Briggs who kept his eyes on his food and spoke only when spoken to. Roscoe said grace, short and unadorned, and then the meal commenced in earnest: salt pork, boiled potatoes, green beans from the kitchen garden, biscuits, and apple butter. Alice ate with quiet attention and did not speak unless someone spoke to her. Roscoe ate the same way, and she noticed that the hired men took their cues from him in terms of conversation. "Dale Webb tells me you walked out from town," Roscoe said to her at one point, not looking up from his plate. "I did," she said. 3 miles in that heat." "I've walked longer and worse," she said. He did look up at that just briefly, and she caught the edge of something in his gray eyes, not quite amusement, not quite surprise, but some combination of both, quickly smoothed away. "You're from Missouri originally?" he asked. "Born in Sullivan County," she said. "My family farmed there." He nodded and returned to his food, and that was the end of the conversation. But that night, lying in the narrow iron bed, while the Kansas wind moved through the eaves of the house, Alice felt something she had not felt since before her father died, the specific quality of being in the right place. It was not comfort exactly, and it was certainly not happiness. Not yet, not with grief still occupying such a significant portion of her chest. It was something more like orientation, like a compass needle settling. She did not know what to make of that feeling, so she put it away and went to sleep. She was at breakfast at 5 o'clock sharp. The harvest work was exactly what she had promised Roscoe it would be. She was not slow, and she was not a problem. She fell into the rhythm of the scythe with the muscle memory of a decade, and the wheat fell in clean, even rows ahead of her. Curtis Webb, who had apparently expected to find her flagging by mid-morning, made a comment around 9 o'clock that was intended to be a compliment but came out sideways, as compliments from rough-handed young men often do. "You swing that thing better than most men I've worked with," he said. "I know," Alice said pleasantly, and swung again. Dale Webb laughed so hard he nearly dropped his own scythe. Roscoe, working 20 feet down the row, said nothing, but Alice saw his mouth move in what might have been the beginning of a smile before he turned away. The days settled into a pattern that was, in its way, a kind of relief after the formless grief of the preceding months. The work was concrete and physical, and left no room for the circling, helpless thoughts that had plagued her on the road. Up at 5, breakfast with Mabel's biscuits and coffee black as river mud. Out to the fields before the heat climbed. Work through the long Kansas morning. A midday dinner of bread and cold meat and water from the well. Back to work in the afternoon. Supper at 7. And then the brief, luminous hour before dark when the light turned everything gold and the wind came down from the north carrying the first hint of the coming autumn. It was in that hour, on the 5th evening, that she first had a real conversation with Roscoe Holloway. She had gone to sit on the back porch steps with a cup of Mabel's coffee, watching the light change over the wheat fields, when she heard the screen door and he came out and stood at the edge of the porch, coffee cup in his own hand, looking at the same view. "The North 40 should be done by Thursday," he said, which was not precisely a personal overture, but was more than he had offered at supper. "I think so," she agreed. "The southwest corner's a bit wet still from that rain last week. Might need another day." He was quiet for a moment. "You know your fields," he said. "I paid attention," she said. "My father said attention was the only free thing in farming, so you might as well use it." Another silence, but it was a comfortable one, the way silences are between people who have done physical work together and established a kind of wordless trust through the labor itself. "Your father's gone?" he asked. "This past winter," she said. "My mother in April. I have no other family to speak of." He said, "I'm sorry," and she could tell that he meant it precisely and not more than that, which she respected more than elaborate condolence. "And you?" she asked, because it seemed fair. "The farm's yours alone." "My father homesteaded the original claim in 1862, he said. "He and my mother built the first house, a soddy back then before the frame house. My mother passed in 71, My father in 75. The farm came to me. He paused. I had a brother who went to Abilene in 73 looking for work and never came back. I got a letter once saying he was fine. That was the last of it. Alice looked at him sideways. He was looking out at the fields, and the late light caught the planes of his face and showed something there she recognized. The particular loneliness of a person who has built a life around hard work precisely because the work asks nothing of you that you are not prepared to give. The farm is beautiful, she said, and meant it. He looked at her then directly in that evaluating way he had that she was starting to understand was simply how he saw things without ornament as they were. "Thank you," he said. And then, after a moment, "You're a good worker, Miss Sutton." "You're a fair employer, Mr. Holloway," she said. He nodded, and they drank their coffee in the last of the evening light, and the border collie came and lay down at the bottom of the steps between them. And that was, without either of them naming it, the moment the distance between them began to close. The following week brought a difficulty that nobody had anticipated. Curtis Webb got into a disagreement in the Copper Horn Saloon on Saturday night and came back Sunday morning with a broken hand, which meant he was useless for harvest work. His brother Dale stayed on but was noticeably less cheerful about things, and Henry Briggs, who had never been particularly communicative, withdrew further into his own silence. The North 40 was not done, and the southwest corner had not dried out, and there was a weather report from the telegraph office, passed along by the storekeeper's wife, who had heard it from the minister, who had gotten it from a traveler coming through, that there was a possibility of early-season storms moving down from Colorado. Roscoe took this information at supper with the same face he brought to everything, but Alice noticed the line of his jaw was tighter than usual, and he ate less than he ordinarily did. After supper she found him in the barn, checking harness and not looking at anything in particular. "We can do it," she said from the barn doorway. "The southwest corner and the North 40. If we start at 4 instead of 5 and work until we can't see, we can be done before any storm comes." He turned to look at her. "That's a long day," he said. "I've done longer," she said, which was the second time she had said it and meant it, and he appeared to receive it the same way he had the first time, not with disbelief but with a kind of recalibration, as if he were adjusting his understanding of what she was made of. "All right," he said. 4 o'clock. 4 o'clock, she agreed. She turned to go and he said, "Miss Sutton." She stopped. "Why are you going this extra mile for my harvest?" he asked, not suspicious exactly but genuinely wanting to know. She thought about it for a moment, leaning in the barn doorway with the evening smell of hay and horses around her. "Because it matters," she said. "This wheat, this farm, it matters to someone, and I'm here and I can help it not be lost. That seems like enough reason to me." He was quiet for a long moment. "Yes," he said finally, "it does." She went back to the house. He stood in the barn for a while longer, looking at the harness and not at anything in particular, and thought about what she had said and what it meant that she had said it. The next 4 days were some of the hardest work Alice had done in her life, and she had done a great deal of hard work. They were up before 4, out in the dark with lanterns until the light came enough to see, and they worked until the stars were already appearing in the eastern sky. Roscoe worked alongside her, not apart the way some employers did, and she found that his working style was much like his speaking style, economical, precise, without waste. He did not make unnecessary motions, and he did not stop unless the stoppage was necessary, and he did not complain. On the third day, in the late afternoon when the heat was still punishing, and the last section of the southwest corner remained to be cut, Henry Briggs quietly laid down his scythe, said he was done, collected his wages from Roscoe without looking him in the face, and walked off down the road toward town. Dale Webb watched him go and then looked at Roscoe and then at Alice and then picked his scythe back up and said, "Well, suppose that means more for the rest of us," and kept working. Alice had been watching Roscoe when Briggs left. His expression did not change. He simply bent back to his work. But she saw his hand tighten on the scythe handle for just a moment, the knuckles going white, and then relax. That evening she went to the well to draw water for washing and found him there already. His face and neck wet from the bucket he had just poured over his own head, his shirt dark with the day's labor. He looked tired in a way that went beyond the body, a tiredness that came from carrying too much alone for too long. She recognized it because she had carried the same thing and still was. She drew her own water and did not say anything for a moment, and then she said, "One more day." "One more day," he agreed. "And if that storm comes in fast," she asked. "Then we take what we have and it is what it is," he said. "I've lost sections before. I'll lose them again." She looked at him. "Has it ever stopped you?" He almost smiled. "No," he said. "Then it won't now," she said, and carried her water back to the house. The storm held off. They finished the southwest corner by mid-afternoon on the fourth day, and by the time the first gray clouds came rolling in from the northwest the following evening, the last of the Holloway wheat was in the windrows, ready for the thrashing crew that was coming through in 2 weeks. Roscoe stood at the edge of the harvested field and looked out at it, and Alice stood beside him, and neither of them said anything for a long time because there was nothing that needed saying. What she did not expect was what happened next. Roscoe turned to her and said, "Come up to the house. I need to pay you out." She followed him to the front room of the house, which she had not been inside before. It was where he kept his desk and his accounts. The room was spare and orderly, with a braided rug on the plank floor and a single landscape painting on the wall that she suspected had belonged to his mother. He opened the desk drawer, counted out money with steady hands, and turned to offer it to her. She looked at the amount in his palm. It was substantially more than they had agreed. "This is too much," she said. "By my count I'm owed $9.75. "Your count is right," he said. "I've given you $19.50. She looked up at him. "Why?" "Because you worked harder than any 2 men I've had on this farm," he said. "And because you stayed when the others didn't, and because the harvest is done, and because that is what it's worth." He paused, and something shifted in his expression, a small, careful opening. "And because you told me it mattered, and you meant it, and I've been paying men for 15 years who didn't mean it half as much." She stood there holding the money and feeling something move through her that was not quite pride and not quite gratitude, but something that lived between them, something that had her own particular color to it. "Thank you," she said, quietly and without excess. He nodded. Then, after a moment, "The thrashing crew comes through in 2 weeks. After that there's fall work, fencing that needs mending, the root cellar wants shoring up, firewood to be cut and stacked for winter. I could use someone who knows what they're doing." He stopped. Then he said, "I don't say that to pressure you. If you have somewhere to be, that's your business. But if you don't, and if you wanted to come back in spring, you could bring whatever you need. Stay on proper. There's good work here, year-round, for someone who wants it." She heard the careful, deliberate formality of it, the way he had constructed the offer to leave her every possible exit, to make sure it was not an imposition or an obligation. And she heard, underneath that carefulness, what was actually being said, which was something like, "I want you to stay. I do not know yet exactly why, but I want you to stay." "I'll think about it," she said, because that was honest. "Take your time," he said. She went to Millhaven the next morning to spend the night at the boarding house before she made any decisions. She sat in the small, stuffy room with its yellow wallpaper and its view of the empty Main Street, and laid her $19.50 on the bed and looked at it, and thought about what she was going to do. She thought about the Missouri farm, which was gone. She thought about the road, which had led here. She thought about the way the Kansas sky looked at 4 in the morning when the lanterns were lit, and the wheat stood black against the first pale edge of dawn, and the way Roscoe Holloway worked beside her in silence that felt more companionable than most conversations she had ever had. She picked up her money, put it back in her skirt pocket, and went to bed. In the morning she walked back to the Holloway farm, and when she came through the front gate, Roscoe was on the porch drinking his coffee, and he watched her come up the path with an expression she could not fully read, though she tried. "I'll take the fall work," she said, "and the spring." He nodded, and she thought she saw the careful easing of something in his face. "All right," he said. "I'll have Mabel get your room ready again." "It does not need any getting ready," Alice said. "I never really left it." This time he actually smiled, and it was exactly what she had suspected it would be: slow to arrive but complete once it got there. And it did something to his whole face that was rather startling in its effect on her. She went inside, and that was that. The weeks that followed had a quality that Alice later found difficult to describe precisely, because they were made of very ordinary things: fence mending and firewood and root cellar repairs, and the long October work of putting a farm to bed for winter. And yet something was being built in the spaces between the work, in the evening hours on the porch, in the conversations over Mabel's suppers, in the particular way that two people who are paying close attention to each other begin to learn each other without making a formal business of it. She learned that he read in the evenings agricultural journals mostly, but also whatever books came through Millhaven, which was not many. She learned that he had strong opinions about the best method for mending split-rail fence, and could be persuaded to defend them at some length if she asked. She learned that he was genuinely kind to animals, and that the border collie, whose name was Captain, had a particular devotion to him that spoke to a reliable history of deserving it. He learned that she had a quick and somewhat dry sense of humor that did not announce itself loudly but was consistently present. He learned that she knew things about farming that he did not know, particularly about soil drainage and crop rotation, and that she would tell him when she thought he was wrong about something, and then let him argue about it, and then turn out to be right. He learned that she was afraid of very little that he could identify, and that the things she was afraid of she kept private, and he respected that because he did the same. Mabel Prout watched all of this with the expression of a woman who has seen a great deal of life, and found it neither surprising nor unpleasant in its patterns, and she cooked particularly good suppers on the evenings when she judged the atmosphere at the table to be especially interesting. The moment that changed things was a Saturday afternoon in late October, when Alice was up on the ladder working on the eaves of the barn. Roscoe had told her he would get to it himself, and she had told him she was already on the ladder and therefore already getting to it, and the ladder shifted on the uneven ground. She did not fall, but she grabbed the eave with both hands and held on, and in approximately 4 seconds Roscoe was there with one hand on the ladder to brace it and the other hand on her waist where she was halfway descended, steadying her down. When she was on the ground they were very close together, and his hand was still at her waist because neither of them had moved quickly to resolve that particular situation. And she looked up at him, and he was looking down at her with an expression she had not seen from him before, open in a way his face was not usually open, as though the fear of her falling had unlocked something that propriety had been keeping shut. "Thank you," she said, which was what she always said to him and which always meant something slightly different. "You could have fallen," he said. "I did not fall," she pointed out. "No," he said, "you didn't." He was still looking at her with that open expression, and she was still looking up at him, and his hand at her waist had not moved. "Alice," he said, and it was the first time he had used her name without the miss in front of it. "Roscoe," she said, trying it out, and something in his expression sharpened very slightly. He stepped back, but he did it slowly, and he did not look away first. "I'll finish the eaves," he said. "All right," she said. He climbed the ladder. She stood below holding it steady, looking up at the barn roof and not at him, and she was aware of her own heartbeat in a way that was new and not unwelcome and considerably inconvenient. That evening at supper Mabel served a peach pie that she had definitely been saving and definitely produced for a specific reason, and said nothing about it, and smiled into her coffee cup. November came with the first real cold, a sharp-toothed prairie wind that rattled the windows and reminded the land that winter was not an abstraction but a serious and arriving fact. The work shifted to the winter preparations. Roscoe dealt with the livestock, the insulating of the barn, the repair of anything that could not wait for spring. and the days shortened until the working hours were compressed into a narrow band of gray light between cold, dark mornings and cold, dark evenings. It was on one of those evenings, in the sitting room where Roscoe had built a fire and Mabel had retired early with her knitting and her candle, that Alice and Roscoe sat on opposite ends of the sofa with his agricultural journal between them, and had a conversation that started as a discussion of whether Kansas soil responded better to deep plowing in fall or spring, and ended somewhere considerably more personal. She could not afterward reconstruct exactly how it traveled from the one to the other. She knew that at some point the journal had been set aside, and that the fire had burned lower, and that he had said something about his father teaching him that a farm was not a business but a relationship, and she had said that she thought that was right, and he had said that he thought the same was true of most things worth having, and there had been a silence in which that statement sat between them and required acknowledgment. "I know you came here for wages," he said, "and I know I've offered you work and you've taken it. I want to be clear that nothing I've said to you has been meant to, that is, I have not made you any kind of offer that you—" He stopped, and she saw the rare sight of Roscoe Holloway uncertain of his words, which was notable. "You have not pressured me into anything," she said. "You've been the most decent employer I've ever had." "That's not—" He stopped again. "I'm not speaking as your employer right now," he said carefully. The fire crackled. Outside, the wind went against the windows. "I know," she said. "Then I want to say plainly," he said, and she could see him constructing the sentence with his characteristic precision, the way he planned his fence rows, "that I have come to care for you a great deal more than is explained by wages or harvest work or anything to do with this farm. And I think you know that, and I think you—" He paused. "I don't know what you think. I'm not a man who assumes." She looked at him for a long moment. The firelight moved across his face and showed her the honest, unguarded person underneath the quietness. The man who had built this farm alone and tended it well and been lonelier than he ever said out loud, and who was now looking at her with gray eyes that were the most direct thing about him in a man who was already more direct than most. "I think," she said slowly, "that I came here for wages and found something I was not looking for and was not prepared for, and have spent the better part of 3 months not knowing what to do with it." "What is it?" he asked. "The thing you found." She looked at him steadily. "You," she said. The words settled between them in the fire-lit room like something solid. He reached across the sofa and took her hand, and she let him, and his hand was large and work-roughened and warm, and it held hers with a gentleness that was, she thought, entirely characteristic of who he was, strength held in reserve, applied only so carefully. "I would like to court you properly," he said, "if that is something you would allow." She laughed a little, quietly, at the formality of it. "Roscoe," she said, "I have been living in your house for 3 months, and I have already told you more about my life than I have told most people I've known for years. I think we are somewhat past the formal beginning." "All right," he said, and his mouth curved. "Then I would like to court you informally, with your permission." "You have it," she said. He did not release her hand, and she did not pull it away, and they sat by the fire for another hour while the wind worked at the windows and the candle on the mantel burned low, and talked about things that had nothing to do with farming at all. His brother somewhere in Texas, or maybe New Mexico. Her childhood in Missouri when her father still had strength and her mother still had health. What they each imagined for the years ahead. What they wanted from life beyond survival. Which was a thing neither of them had permitted themselves to think about for some time. When Mabel came through the room at 10 o'clock on her way to bed and found them sitting close together on the sofa, she said, "Good night," in a tone that contained several layers of entirely unsurprised satisfaction, and went on. What followed was a courtship that was as particular to the two of them as everything else about them, not lavish or demonstrative in the way of people who need to perform their affections for an audience, but steady and real. He rode with her to Millhaven on Saturdays, and they walked the short main street and looked at the goods in the store window, and sometimes went to the small eating house for a meal that Mabel had not cooked. He brought her things he had noticed she admired, a good penknife from the hardware store when he heard her say she needed a better one, a book of poetry someone had traded at the general store that he happened to know she would like, a handful of late autumn wildflowers that he left on the washstand outside her room without comment or ceremony, which was perhaps exactly right. She reciprocated in kind. She repaired a tear in his winter coat that Mabel had been putting off. She memorized how he liked his coffee and made sure it was right on the mornings when she was up before Mabel. She listened to him with the full, careful attention she brought to everything, and asked him questions that showed she had heard every word he had said before. On the Sunday before Christmas, he took her for a drive in the wagon out to the cedar ridge that gave Cedar Creek Road its name, where a row of old trees made an unlikely windbreak against the sky. The day was cold and clear, and the light was the pure pale gold of a Kansas winter noon, and he spread a wool blanket on the wagon seat and another across their laps, and they sat at the edge of the ridge looking out at the enormous flat sweep of the country below them, his country, her country now in some way she was beginning to understand. "I want to ask you something," he said, which was how he had begun several conversations, but this time the quality of it was different and she felt it. "Ask it," she said. "I want to marry you," he said, "if you're willing. I know you came here to work and to get your footing back, and I know it's been only a few months, and I'm not going to pretend the farm is glamorous or that I'm the easiest man to live with, because I know I can be quiet in ways that are hard on people. But I love you, Alice. I have for a while now, and I wanted you to know it, and I wanted to ask you plainly." She turned to look at him. He was looking straight ahead because that was how he said difficult things without theater, without performance, looking at the horizon while the important words came out. "Roscoe," she said. He turned then. "I love you too," she said. "And yes." He breathed out, and in the cold air she could see the breath, and she thought that she had never found another person's breath so endearing before. He reached up and put his hand against her face, carefully, as if she were something he could not quite believe was real, and then he kissed her, and it was the kind of first kiss between two private people who do not do anything lightly serious and tender and complete. "Yes," she said again against his mouth, in case he needed to hear it twice. They drove back to the farm in the late afternoon, and Roscoe told Mabel at supper, simply and directly, and Mabel set down her serving spoon and pressed both hands against her apron front and said, "Well, it is about time," with a force of conviction that suggested she had been waiting to say it for at least 6 weeks. They were married on the 14th of February, 1879, by the minister at the Millhaven church, a ceremony that was attended by Mabel, the Webb brothers who had come back through on another job, and were pleased to see the occasion, the storekeeper and his wife, and a scattering of the neighboring farm families who had been watching the Holloway farm situation with the usual combination of goodwill and intense local curiosity. Alice wore her best dress, which was blue wool and had been made by her mother's hands years ago, and Roscoe wore a good coat that he had ordered from the catalog and that fit him well, and they stood in the small church with the winter light coming through the plain glass windows, and made their promises to each other in steady voices. What Alice could not have told you, in the months that followed, was when exactly the farm stopped feeling like a place she had landed and started feeling like home. It happened the way important things often happen, not in one moment but in the accumulation of moments, in the seasons passing through the land and through them together. Spring came to Kansas in 1879, with the particular violence of Prairie Springs rain that came sideways, cold nights that threatened late frost, and then abruptly, as if a door had been opened, warmth and sun, and the extraordinary green of new wheat coming up through turned earth. Roscoe planted the spring wheat in April, and Alice worked alongside him, and she had brought back from Millhaven, as he had once told her she could, whatever she needed, which turned out to be a collection of seed packets from the hardware store, a second-hand canning pot that would expand Mabel's already considerable operations, and a cutting from a rosebush that the storekeeper's wife had insisted she take, because the storekeeper's wife was that kind of person. She planted the rose cutting at the corner of the porch, and Roscoe watched her do it without comment, but she saw him look at it every morning when he came out for coffee, as if he was marking its progress. That spring also brought word from Roscoe's brother, which was something neither of them had expected. A letter came addressed in an unfamiliar hand from a town called Las Cruces in New Mexico Territory, and Roscoe read it at the kitchen table with an expression she had not seen on him before, careful and complicated. The face of a man who had been a long time without something and did not quite know how to hold the fact of its return. The brother's name was Thomas, and he had been, he wrote, a cowhand and then a small rancher and then a man of somewhat uncertain occupation in the years between, the letter's vagueness on the latter point suggesting that some of those occupations had not been strictly above reproach. He had married a woman named Lucinda. He had 2 children. He had heard through some extraordinary chain of coincidence from a man passing through Las Cruces who had come from Kansas that Roscoe Holloway of Millhaven had gotten married, and he wanted to know if that was true, and if his brother was still alive, and if there was any possibility of correspondence. Roscoe sat with the letter for a long time. Then he wrote back. Alice did not ask what he wrote because he would tell her if he wanted to, and because she understood that there were things that needed to be approached without audience. He told her that evening by the fire that he had written to Thomas that yes, it was true, and yes, he was alive, and that he would welcome correspondence if Thomas meant to provide it. "Do you think he will?" she asked. "I don't know," Roscoe said. "I'm not sure I know Thomas anymore. I knew him when he was 19 and angry about things he couldn't name. What he is at 35 I can't say." "Do you want him to write back?" she asked. He was quiet for a moment. "Yes," he said, "I think I do." Thomas wrote back in May. The correspondence began slowly and then steadied into something that was not quite intimacy, but was genuine, 2 brothers feeling their way back toward each other across a very large distance of geography and years. By summer, there was talk of a visit, which ultimately did not happen that year due to circumstances on Thomas's end that his letters were characteristically vague about, but the talk of it mattered anyway. The summer of 1879 on the Holloway farm was full in every sense of the word. The wheat came up good, better than the previous year, because they had worked together over the winter to mend the drainage in the southwest corner, and the soil had benefited from it. Roscoe hired 2 hands for the harvest, reliable men this time, recommended by the neighboring Decker farm, and the work was done in good order without the drama of the previous year. It was in the middle of that harvest, on a long August day that felt exactly like the August day a year before, that Alice looked up from her work and found Roscoe watching her from across the field with that particular look on his face that she had come to know well. The one that said he was feeling something he did not have words for at the moment, and was content to feel it without words. She straightened and caught his eye, and he raised a hand in the small, contained wave that was all the extravagance he ever offered in public, and she smiled at him and turned back to her work, and the wheat fell in clean rows. That evening, she told him, she thought she might be expecting. He was standing at the wash basin when she said it, and he went very still in a way that was not shock but something more like the silence that comes before something large. Then he turned around. "You think," he said. "I think," she said. "Mabel thinks so too. I haven't said anything before because I wanted to be more certain." He crossed the room and put both hands on her face very gently, and looked at her for a long moment with those gray eyes that were the most expressive part of him, and she saw everything in them. The joy, the fear that comes with joy when you have lost a great deal already, the tremendous gravity of it, and underneath all of that, something warm and certain and enduring. "Alice," he said, and did not say anything else, because there was not anything else that was necessary. "I know," she said. Mabel, when informed at supper in the only matter-of-fact way available in a household of people who did things matter-of-factly, pressed her lips together and then pressed them harder, and then said, "Right, then," and went to the pantry and came back with a jar of cherry preserves that she had been saving and opened it then and there. The pregnancy proceeded through the fall and winter the way most things proceeded on the Holloway farm, steadily and without unnecessary drama, or at least without unnecessary drama until it provided its own. Alice was not a woman who asked to be managed, and she continued working at a pace that Roscoe occasionally attempted to moderate, with the results that might be expected between two people of very similar stubbornness. There were evenings when she was tired in a way she had not been before, and the tiredness had a different quality to it, and he would find her asleep in the sitting-room chair with the lamp still burning, and he would turn down the lamp and get a blanket from the bedroom and put it over her without waking her and go back to his reading. She knew he did this. She pretended not to know. She appreciated it enormously and would not have said so in those specific terms, and he knew she would not have said so, which was part of why he did it. The winter of 1879 going into 1880 was the kind of Kansas winter that reminded people why the prairie was not forgiving even when it was beautiful. 2 blizzards came through in January, the second bad enough that they were effectively housebound for 4 days. Roscoe went out each morning to tend the livestock and came back with ice in his beard and the particular expression of a man who has fought the weather and reached a sensible draw. And Alice made sure the kitchen was warm and the food was good, and the 4 days of close quarters produced, rather than friction, the best conversations they had had since the evenings in the first months when they were still learning each other. Thomas Holloway, living in New Mexico Territory, wrote a letter in February that was the most personal he had yet managed, in which he acknowledged, somewhat indirectly but clearly, that the years between Abilene and the present had included things he was not proud of, and that he hoped Roscoe would not judge him by them. Roscoe wrote back that he was not in the business of judging his brother's history, only his present, and that as far as he could tell the present looked honest. Thomas wrote back and said that was a better response than he deserved. "Are you going to invite him to come?" Alice asked one evening. "I already have," Roscoe said, "in the spring when the road's better." She looked at him. "When did you decide that?" "February," he said. "I decided in February. It just took me a while to write the letter." She leaned her head briefly against his shoulder, which was something she did sometimes and which he received without comment because he thought it was one of the better things that had happened to him. "Good," she said. In the second week of March, 1880, Alice went into labor with the assistance of Mabel, who had attended several births and was composed about the whole business, and the local midwife from town who had arrived with Roscoe's very fast horse beneath her, and a bag of equipment, and a calm that was its own kind of gift. Roscoe was confined to the front of the house in the way that men were in 1880, a confinement he endured with a particular tight-lipped anxiety that Mabel could hear through the walls and that she chose not to address because it was, she felt, appropriate. The baby was a boy. He arrived red-faced and loud and entirely himself, on a cold March morning with the wind coming hard from the north, and when Mabel carried him out to the front room, Roscoe stood up from his chair and looked at his son, and was, for a moment, the most undone that Alice had ever seen him, not in a broken way, but in the way of someone who has been given something they had not let themselves fully imagine having. He went in to Alice. She was tired and proud and looking at him with eyes that were soft in a way they were not usually soft. "He has your hair," she said. "He has your nose," he said. "Thank God," she laughed, which was not what she had expected to do in that moment, but it was entirely what the moment called for. "What should we call him?" she asked. They had discussed names and not decided, because deciding things in the abstract had always seemed to both of them slightly premature when the real thing had not yet arrived. Now the real thing had arrived and was wrapped in a blanket in Roscoe's arms and making the small continuous sounds of a person who was already very committed to his own existence. "James," Roscoe said. It had been his father's name. "James," Alice said, trying it. "James Holloway," she nodded. "Yes." James Holloway opened his eyes, which were the unfocused blue-gray of all new babies, and looked at no one in particular, and was entirely unconcerned with the weight of the name or the moment, which was also, they would learn over the following months, entirely characteristic of him. Spring came to the farm that year with the rose-cutting Alice had planted at the corner of the porch putting out its first tentative leaves, and with James Holloway in a basket in a sunny spot of the kitchen and Mabel completely unable to pretend she was not enthralled by him. Thomas Holloway wrote to say that he and Lucinda and the two children, a boy of 6 and a girl of 4, would be coming through Kansas in May on their way north, and asked if the offer of a visit still stood. It still stood. They arrived on a Thursday afternoon in May, pulling in on a wagon that had seen better decades but was held together with careful maintenance and determination, Thomas Holloway handling the reins with the ease of a man who had spent a great deal of time behind a horse. He was 2 years younger than Roscoe and looked it in the bones of his face, but the years between Abilene and Las Cruces had put something in his eyes that was older than his age, a knowledge of hard things that he wore without making a show of it. His wife Lucinda was a small, dark-haired woman from New Mexico with good strong hands and a direct gaze, and the particular competence of a woman who has built a life in a difficult country. The two brothers stood in the yard and looked at each other for a moment that was long by any standard, and then Thomas said, "You look old," and Roscoe said, "You look like trouble," and Thomas laughed, and Roscoe put a hand on his brother's shoulder, and that was a great deal from the two of them. Lucinda and Alice took each other's measure in the efficient way of women who recognize another capable person, and within an hour of the wagon pulling in they were in the kitchen with Mabel. James passed between them like the most welcome of burdens, the conversation already moving fast and easy. Thomas's boy, whose name was Will, immediately fell into a concentrated investigation of the barn that Captain the Border Collie assisted enthusiastically. Thomas's girl, whose name was Rosa, sat on the porch steps with her doll and watched everyone with enormous dark eyes and spoke when she was ready to. The 4 days that Thomas and his family spent at the Holloway farm were, it seemed to everyone involved, the retrieval of something that had been set down for too long. The brothers talked in the evenings the way brothers do when they have a great deal of catching up to do, and are not entirely sure where to begin, circling gradually toward the important things through the outer rings of easier conversation. On the last evening, after the children were asleep and Lucinda and Alice had gone inside, Roscoe and Thomas sat on the porch with coffee going cold in their cups and talked about the years between Abilene and the present, and about their father, and about the farm, and about what it meant to be the age they were with the lives they had made, and about whether Thomas's situation in New Mexico was truly settled or whether there was still the kind of uncertainty in it that his letters had been somewhat evasive about. Thomas was honest, which was what the conversation required. He said that things had been difficult and that he had not always made good choices and that Lucinda's steadiness had been the thing that had kept the worst outcomes at bay. He said that he was genuinely settled now, or as settled as a man of his temperament was likely to get. He said the children were good and that was worth everything else. Roscoe listened, and when Thomas was done he said, "I'm glad you came." Just that. Thomas looked at him. "I'm glad you let me," he said. They sat in the dark a while longer and said nothing, which was a comfortable kind of silence between brothers who have found their way back to each other and do not feel the need to make a great deal of noise about it. Thomas and his family left on a Friday morning, the wagon loaded and the children aboard. Lucinda and Alice had exchanged addresses and promises of letters that they both intended to keep. Thomas and Roscoe shook hands and then, with a brief awkwardness that was both of their natures asserting themselves, embraced, and it was obviously the right thing because both of them looked better afterward. The wagon went down the Cedar Creek Road and around the bend, and Roscoe stood watching it go, and Alice came to stand beside him, and James was in her arms, making the small sounds he made when he was awake and content. "Good?" she asked. "Yes," Roscoe said. "Good." Summer arrived and the wheat grew, and the farm ran in the full stride of a well-tended operation that had found its rhythm. Roscoe hired his harvest hands for the season with more confidence than he had the previous years, because the farm's reputation had improved. It was known in the county as a fair employer, and fair employers in 1880 Kansas were not so common that they were taken for granted. The wheat came off in clean, organized rows, and Alice worked alongside the crew because she wanted to, and because she was capable of it, and because Roscoe had long since stopped making any argument about it that he expected to win. James, who was 5 months old at harvest time, and had developed the extremely strong opinion that he ought to be included in whatever was happening, was minded in the afternoons by Mabel, with a competence and evident satisfaction that suggested Mabel had been waiting for this particular occupation for some time. One afternoon during harvest, near the end of the day when the light was going golden and the crew was finishing the last of the south field, the storekeeper's wife from Millhaven appeared in a buggy at the edge of the farm road, accompanied by 2 other women from town. They had come ostensibly to call on Alice, and Alice went to meet them with James on her hip and the harvest crew visible in the background, and her hair somewhat escaped from its pins. And the storekeeper's wife looked at all of this and said, with the sincerity of a person who has reconsidered an earlier assessment and found themselves pleased to be wrong, "Mrs. Holloway, you look very well." "I feel very well," Alice said honestly. "We heard the harvest is going fine," said one of the other women. "Better than fine," Alice said. The storekeeper's wife looked at James, who looked back at her with the steady, evaluating gaze of a 5-month-old who has already developed opinions, and said, "What a fine boy," and James apparently found this acceptable because he did not object. They stayed for coffee that Mabel produced with hospitable efficiency, and the conversation moved through the usual channels of small-town life: the minister's new wife, the land office business, the question of whether the county road to the east ought to be improved before next spring, and Alice participated with ease, because she had come to know these women over the months and they had come to know her, and the initial formality of the outsider from Missouri had long since resolved itself into something warmer. After they left, Roscoe, who had come in from the fields and heard the end of the visit from the kitchen, said, "What did they want?" "Company," Alice said. "And to look at James." "Is that it?" "And to see that I'm still here," she said. "Small towns like to know their people are staying." He looked at her. "Are you?" he said, and she knew he was not asking about the town's assessment but his own, the question underneath all the other questions, the one he would never stop quietly wondering because he was the kind of person who could not take a good thing entirely for granted. She handed him James, who grabbed a fistful of his shirt with considerable determination. "You could not get rid of me," she said, "if you tried." The smile came, the slow and complete one. "Good," he said. The following year brought the full weight of their built life bearing down on them in all the ways life tends to. Once it knows you can take the weight. James learned to walk in February, which was, Roscoe observed with some concern, even earlier than he might have wished, since James appeared to regard the ability to walk as primarily an opportunity to reach things he had previously been safely prevented from reaching. The farm went through a difficult spring with a late frost that damaged a portion of the kitchen garden and required replanting, and the fence on the north pasture gave out in a way that needed significant attention, and for 2 weeks in April everything seemed to be demanding repair simultaneously, and the days were very long. And yet there was a quality to those hard weeks that Alice recognized as the specific texture of a life that is genuinely yours, not easy, not without difficulty, but fundamentally sound in its structure, tended by 2 people who were committed to it and to each other. She found a letter on the desk one evening that Roscoe had been writing to Thomas. Not a letter she snooped on, but one he had left open deliberately, she thought, knowing she might read it, the way they had developed the habit of leaving certain things visible to each other that were hard to say directly. In it he described the farm, the spring difficulties, James's walking, and then, near the end, in his careful, deliberate hand, "I understand now what Father meant about the farm being a relationship and not a business. Alice understands it too, which is why it works. I think I was lonely in ways I did not recognize until I was not lonely anymore." She put the letter back and did not mention it, and felt something warm move through her chest that had no name better than love, and that was enough. By the summer of 1881, the Holloway farm had grown in scope and standing. Roscoe had purchased the 15 acres that abutted the west edge of his property from a neighboring farmer who was leaving Kansas for Oregon, which expanded the wheat operation meaningfully. Alice had taken on the management of the kitchen garden, with a seriousness that had resulted in Mabel being almost offensively well supplied with ingredients, and she had also begun a small egg-selling operation in Millhaven that supplemented the farm's income by a modest but consistent amount. James was a year and a half old and already the kind of child who made adults tired and adoring in equal measure, cheerful, determined, loud when he had something to say, and capable of a sudden grave seriousness that he had apparently inherited from both parents and was therefore doubly concentrated. It was in July of that summer that Alice told Roscoe she was expecting again. This time she told him in the morning over coffee in the kitchen, because the second time you say something important you do not need to find the perfect moment for it, you just say it. He set down his coffee cup. He looked at her. He said, "How are you feeling?" And that was all, and she understood that he had absorbed the information and was already reorganizing himself around it in the quiet, practical way he had. "Good," she said. "Better than last time at this point. I'm not as tired." He nodded. Then he reached across the table and took her hand and held it, and that was that. The second child came in January of 1882 on a day when the sky was the brilliant deep blue of a cold, clear winter, and the light on the snow was almost painful to look at. It was a girl, which was a surprise to no one but themselves, because they had assumed a second son and found themselves, in the moment, entirely delighted to be wrong. She was small and fierce, and had Alice's coloring dark hair and the brown eyes that Alice's mother had also had, and she made her presence known in the first minutes with the particular conviction of a person who intends to be noticed. James, brought in to meet his sister with the careful ceremony of a toddler being presented to something consequential, looked at her for a long moment with his father's evaluating gray eyes, and then patted her blanket once with the flat of his hand in what was apparently a greeting, and then turned his attention back to the room in general, having concluded that this new element was acceptable. They named her Clara, because Alice had loved the name since she was a girl and had been saving it. Mabel, when Clara was put in her arms for the first time, said nothing at all for almost a full minute, which was the longest Mabel had ever been silent about anything, and which said everything. Life in the years that followed settled into the deep rhythm of a family that has found its shape and is growing into it. The farm prospered in the measured way of a well-run Kansas wheat operation, not dramatically, not overnight, but with the steady accumulation of good years outpacing the bad ones. Roscoe and Alice worked it together in the partnership that had always been the truest thing about them, and they taught the children the same way they did everything, not with lectures, but by example, by presence, by the daily demonstration of what it looked like to care for something and to care for each other. Thomas and Lucinda came to visit again in 1882, and this time stayed 2 weeks, and the children played together in the summer heat with the easy democracy of children who are too young to be aware of the distance that separates their lives ordinarily. Roscoe and Thomas spent long evenings on the porch that now had, at the corner, a rose bush that had grown into something substantial and bloomed in June with a determination that Alice found gratifying. The brothers talked less carefully now and laughed more, and Lucinda and Alice had by that point established a correspondence of some warmth, and were genuinely glad to be in the same room, and not only on paper. On the last evening of that visit, after supper, when the children were asleep and Mabel had retired, the four of them sat on the porch in the summer dark with the stars brilliant above the flat prairie horizon, and the conversation moved among them easily, and there was a quality to the evening that Alice tried to hold the whole of in her mind as it was happening, the children sleeping inside, the warm air still moving, the lamp on the porch throwing a circle of yellow light. Roscoe's hand around hers on the arm of the porch chair, Thomas's voice carrying some story about New Mexico that made Lucinda roll her eyes and laugh, the rose bush invisible in the dark but present, rooted and alive. She knew, sitting there, what had happened in the years since she had walked into Millhaven with 43 cents and a battered carpetbag. She had come to work his harvest for wages, and he had paid her double and asked her to come back in spring with whatever she needed, and she had come back and she had brought herself, and that had turned out to be everything. She had lost her family and found a family. She had lost her ground and found ground. She had walked west with nothing, and arrived somewhere that was genuinely hers. She was not a person given to sentiment as a performance, but she felt it then, in the way she imagined it was meant to be felt, not as something soft and helpless but as something substantial and earned, the particular happiness of a person who knows exactly how the good things came to be and what it cost to get them. Roscoe turned his head and looked at her in the lamplight, and she knew that look by now in all its variations. This was the one that meant he was grateful, the full and genuine gratitude of a man who had expected to do this life alone and had been given a different thing entirely. "All right?" he asked quietly, under Thomas's ongoing New Mexico story. "All right," she said. He turned back to his brother and squeezed her hand once, briefly, and let it go and picked up his coffee, and the night went on around them warm and full. When Thomas and his family departed in the morning, the goodbyes were easier than the first visit's goodbyes had been, because they were not goodbyes that required grief anymore. They were the goodbyes of people who intend to see each other again and know they will. Alice stood in the yard watching the wagon go, Clara in her arms and James standing solidly beside her with his hand in her skirt, and Roscoe beside her with his coffee cup, and the summer sun coming up over the eastern prairie in a great wash of gold. "They'll come back," she said. "They will," he agreed. In the fall of 1882, there was an incident that was the closest the Holloway farm came in those years to serious trouble. A dispute over the western boundary of the new 15-acre parcel, the land purchased from the departing neighbor, became contentious when a man named Gareth Crane, who had been eyeing that particular piece of ground himself and had not moved fast enough to claim it, began making noises about the validity of the purchase through the land office, and then, less formally, through the kind of pressure that men applied in the 1880s when they wanted something and did not quite have the legitimate means to get it. Crane was a large man with a large opinion of himself and a small but loyal collection of men who worked for him and took their cues from him, and on a Wednesday afternoon in October, he appeared at the Holloway farm gate with two of those men and a disposition for confrontation. Roscoe went out to meet him at the gate, and Alice came to the porch because she was not the kind of woman who went inside when things got tense. She watched, and she could see from the set of Roscoe's shoulders and the way he was standing very still, very grounded, the way she had first seen him in the north field, that he was not going to be moved. Crane made his assertions, which were loud and not particularly logical, and Roscoe listened to them in their entirety without interrupting, and then said clearly, and without raising his voice, that the deed was filed at the county land office, and the purchase was legitimate, and that he had nothing further to say about it. Crane made the kind of veiled implication that was common in those situations, suggesting that the matter might not resolve itself peacefully if Roscoe remained stubborn, and Roscoe said, with the same evenness he brought to everything, that he had the deed and he had a lawyer in Millhaven who had reviewed it and he was not concerned. Crane left. His men left. The situation resolved itself over the following weeks through the land office and a county judge who reviewed the documentation and found, as Roscoe had known he would, that the deed was entirely in order. Crane subsided because the alternative was a legal dispute he was going to lose. Alice, after Crane's departure that Wednesday afternoon, came down from the porch and stood at the gate beside Roscoe. "You handled that well," she said. "There was nothing to handle," he said. "He's got no claim and he knows it." "He was hoping you'd get rattled," she observed. "I know," he said. "You didn't," she said. "No," he said. She looked at him. "You are a genuinely difficult man to rattle." "Yes," he said without apology, which was correct. "I find it very reassuring," she said. He looked at her with his mouth curved. "I know you do," he said. By the time 1883 arrived, the Holloway farm was one of the most reliably productive in the county, which was not a distinction that Roscoe sought or made any particular noise about, but which meant that, when the County Agricultural Board held its annual discussion about things like road improvements and irrigation and crop diversity, Roscoe's opinion was requested and generally respected. Alice had, in addition to her farming partnership with Roscoe and her management of the children and the kitchen operation, become something of a resource for the women of the area who were in the situation she had once been in, coming to a new place alone, needing work, needing to find their footing. It was not a formal thing, and she would not have called it such, but it was real. She knew which farms were hiring and whether they were decent employers. She knew Mabel's recipe for a cold weather remedy that was reliably effective. She had connections at the Millhaven General Store and the boarding house and the land office. She used them freely and without fanfare. Roscoe noticed this, the way he noticed everything, and said nothing about it, and was proud of it in the quiet, certain way he was proud of everything she did. In the spring of 1883, Alice told him she thought there might be a third child coming. This time he got up from his chair and came around the table and put both arms around her, just held her for a moment in the kitchen with the morning light coming through the window and the sound of James already audible somewhere upstairs in the characteristic style of an energetic 3-year-old who has decided that sleeping is a suggestion. "3," he said, into her hair. "3," she confirmed. He held her a moment longer. "We'll need to expand the root cellar," he said. She laughed. "That is your response." "It's a practical household," he said. "It is," she agreed, and did not move out of his arms. The third child was born in October of 1883, another boy, and they named him Samuel after no one in particular, but because the name was strong and stood on its own, and he came into the world as placidly as James had come into it determinedly, and Clara had come into it fiercely, which suggested something about his temperament that proved, over the months that followed, to be accurate. Samuel was a calm and observant child who watched the world carefully and acted on what he observed with a deliberate, unhurried efficiency that made Mabel say once, with considerable conviction, that he was going to be someone worth knowing when he grew up. Mabel herself, by 1884, was 68 years old and had been with the Holloway farm for more than a decade. She was not the same woman she had been when Alice had arrived. She was slower. The winters were harder on her, and she had a cough in the cold months that she waved off any concern about with characteristic briskness. But she was also not reduced. She was Mabel, entirely and without compromise. Alice worried about her. So one evening, "I worry about you," she said directly, because that was how she did things. "I'm aware," Mabel said. "Stop it. The winters are hard on your chest," Alice said. "The winters are hard on everything," Mabel said. "That is the nature of winter. I have survived 68 of them and I intend to survive more." "I know," Alice said, "but I would like, if you would allow it, to take on more of the kitchen work so that you can rest when you need to." Mabel looked at her for a moment. "You have 3 children and a farm and a husband and half a dozen women in the county you're advising one way or another," she said. "When do you propose to find the time?" "I'll find it," Alice said. Mabel was quiet for a moment. "That winter cold remedy," she finally said. "You do it wrong. You add the ginger too soon and the steam's gone by the time it matters." "Show me how to do it right," Alice said. "Fine," Mabel said and turned back to her stove, and that was the end of the negotiation. The arrangement worked as arrangements do when they are made between two sensible people, imperfectly but genuinely. Alice took on the heavier kitchen work and the bread baking that had been Mabel's special domain, and Mabel supervised with the authoritative commentary of a woman who has earned the right to supervise. And between them, the kitchen ran well, and Mabel rested more than she would have otherwise, and the cough was better in the winter of 1884 than it had been in 1883, which Alice counted as a victory, and did not make a production of, because Mabel would have found that irritating. Thomas wrote in the spring of 1884 to say that he and Lucinda had decided to leave New Mexico and come north. They were looking at land in Colorado, and if the land worked out, Kansas would be a deal closer than New Mexico, and perhaps the visits could be more frequent. Roscoe wrote back that he thought that was an excellent plan, and that there was room at the Holloway farm for them while they were looking, if they needed a base of operations. They took him up on it in the summer, Thomas, Lucinda, and their children, who were now 11 and 9, and had developed the specific competence of children raised on a working ranch. Will, the elder, was tall and quiet like his uncle, and took immediately to working alongside Roscoe in the way that young men take to men who know their business and don't condescend. Rosa had grown into a girl who was sharp and funny, and had opinions that she expressed clearly, which reminded everyone of Alice in a way that Lucinda mentioned and Thomas enthusiastically agreed with. James, at 4, followed Will around with the wholehearted devotion of a small child attaching himself to an older one, and Will endured this with the goodwill that suggested he was going to be the kind of man who was kind to younger people, without making a show of it. Clara and Rosa made fast friends in the way of girls who recognize each other's qualities, and Samuel observed all of this from his characteristic position of calm attentiveness and made his own quiet assessments. The Colorado land worked out. Thomas and Lucinda settled in Pueblo County by the fall of 1884, which was indeed much closer, and the following spring Roscoe and Alice drove up with the children to see the new place, and Alice looked at Lucinda's kitchen garden and made suggestions about the dry Colorado soil that Lucinda implemented, and that worked. And Roscoe looked at Thomas's barn and made suggestions about the framing that Thomas implemented, and that also worked. And at the end of the visit, Thomas said, "I should have come back years ago," and Roscoe said, "Yes," without elaboration, but his hand was on his brother's shoulder. The years accumulated. James started school in 1884 and took to it with a competence that was gratifying, though his teacher, a young woman from Ohio, told Alice that he was a great deal of personality for a 4-year-old classroom and she should know. Alice said she was aware. Clara followed him to school in 1886, at which point James's teacher said, with slightly more complexity of expression, that Clara Holloway was the most organized child she had ever encountered, and had already restructured the classroom library in a way that was frankly an improvement, but that she was not sure she felt comfortable accepting from a 6-year-old. Alice came home and told Roscoe this, and he said, in the dry way that had become a particular pleasure of their conversation, that he could not imagine where Clara got it. Samuel reached school age in 1887 and attended with the same unhurried competence he brought to everything, and the teacher, who was a different woman by that point and had been forewarned by her predecessor about the Holloway children, said he was a delight and perfectly reasonable, and seemed surprised by this, which caused some amusement at the Holloway supper table. Mabel turned 72 in 1888 and was still running the household by the authority of long habit and personal force of will, though she and Alice had by that point arrived at a genuine partnership of the kitchen that suited them both. Her health had continued on balance, to be better managed than it might have been without Alice's practical intervention, and she remained sharp and opinionated and entirely herself, which was all she had ever asked to be. In the early spring of 1889, something happened that Alice had not expected but recognized, when it arrived, as something that had been coming for a while. Roscoe came in from the fields one afternoon, an ordinary Tuesday afternoon, and sat down at the kitchen table without his boots off yet, which was unusual enough that she turned from the stove to look at him. "What is it?" she said. He put a piece of paper on the table. It was a letter from the County Agricultural Board, which had apparently been in correspondence with a man in Wichita who was looking to expand his wheat operation and had been asking about established farms in the county that might be interested in selling or in a partnership arrangement. "He's offering serious money," Roscoe said, "for the farm." She sat down across from him. "What are you thinking?" She asked because she wanted to know before she said anything. He was quiet for a long time, looking at the paper without reading it. "I'm thinking it's a lot of money," he said, "and I'm thinking it does not matter." "Why doesn't it matter?" she asked. He looked up. "Because this is where we are," he said. "This is where James was born and Clara and Samuel. This is where you planted that rose and it grew. My father built here. This is not something you sell." She held his gaze for a moment. Then she said, "Then write back and say no." He nodded. "I already decided," he said. "I just wanted to tell you." "I know," she said. "I'm glad you did." He got up, took his boots off at the door, put the letter in the stove, and poured himself coffee. That evening, after the children were in bed, they sat on the porch as they had sat on countless evenings, and the rose at the corner of the porch was putting out its first buds of the season, and the June bug chorus was just beginning in the grasses, and the sky was that specific dark blue that Kansas evenings had in late spring when the heat had gone, but the warmth was still in the boards of the porch. "I've been thinking," Alice said. "I know," he said. "You always have," she smiled. "I've been thinking about the southwest field, the one we drained the year I came. I think it's ready to try a different crop. The soil's different now. I read something about clover as a rotation crop and what it does to the nitrogen." "Show me what you read," he said. "Tomorrow," she said. "Tomorrow," he agreed. The silence that followed was the good kind, the kind that two people share when they have said what needed saying and are content to be where they are. The border collie captain had died the previous winter, very old and very loved, and they had a new dog now, a young shepherd named Dell, who was still learning the protocols of the farm but was enthusiastic about the education. Dell came and laid down at the top of the porch steps, thumping his tail once against the boards. "Roscoe," she said. "Alice," he said. "I'm glad the ladder slipped," she said, which was a reference to the barn eve incident of their first October, and which she had never mentioned in quite those terms before. He turned his head and looked at her. The lamplight was behind them from inside the house, and it lit his profile and the gray at his temples that had come in gradually over the last years and that she had always liked, and his eyes when he turned were the steady gray they had always been. "So am I," he said. She took his hand, and they sat on the porch until the stars were well established and the temperature had dropped enough that the blanket she had brought out was genuinely necessary, and then they went inside. The Holloway farm stood at the edge of the Cedar Creek Road as it had always stood, the red barn bright in whatever light fell on it, the frame house with the covered porch, the kitchen garden behind its low fence, the windmill steady against the Kansas sky. The rose at the corner of the porch bloomed every June with the specific faithfulness of something that had put its roots in and meant to stay. James Holloway grew into a young man with his father's steadiness and his mother's directness, and the combination of both that made him, when he was fully grown, the kind of person other people trusted without quite knowing why. Clara Holloway grew into the organized and sharp-minded girl she had always been, and went further with it than her teacher had probably expected, because she had two parents who expected a great deal of her, and also made entirely clear that whatever she chose to do with herself was worth the full exertion of everything she had. Samuel Holloway grew into the calm and observant man that Mabel had predicted, and Mabel was never told she had been wrong about him, because she had already concluded as much and did not need the confirmation. Thomas and Lucinda came to Kansas every year or two, and on the years they could not come, letters moved between the two households with the regularity of a relationship that had decided it was going to sustain itself, and was doing so. Will and James maintained a separate correspondence of their own that their parents were aware of and pleased by. Mabel Prout remained at the Holloway farm until she was 75, at which point she accepted, with approximately the grace of a person who has been persuaded of something sensible against their better judgment, that her sister in Lawrence was asking for her, and that the winters on the farm were not what they had been, and that Alice and Roscoe could manage without her if they had to, which she qualified with a comprehensive list of the things they should make sure not to get wrong. She left on a September morning in 1891 with her bags packed and her opinions fully expressed, and she pressed Alice's hand at the gate and said, "You are exactly what this farm needed," which was the most effusive thing she had ever said about anything. Alice said, "So were you," and meant it, and Mabel said, "Well," and got in the wagon and went. They received letters from her in Lawrence that were characteristically brisk and opinionated and fully alive, and were glad to have them. What Roscoe Holloway had built in the years since his father's homestead had expanded and deepened and become something larger than he had originally conceived for it, not in acreage, though the acreage had grown, but in the measure of things that do not go on the county register. A marriage that was a genuine partnership. 3 children who were capable and kind and knew the value of what they came from. A brother returned from a long absence. A community that knew the Holloway name to mean something reliable and fair. And Alice Sutton, who had walked 3 miles in the Kansas heat with nothing in her pocket and met him at the edge of his north field and told him she could do the work and meant it. Who had stayed when the others didn't. Who had come back in spring with what she needed, which had turned out to be herself and her full, considerable self at that, her knowledge and her grief and her capability and her willingness to love something as specifically and unreservedly as she loved this farm, this man, this life. She thought sometimes about the notice she had pulled off the post in Millhaven, the brown paper, the uneven letters, the plain statement of what was on offer. Harvest hands wanted. Good wages paid. HOLLOWAY farm. She had come for wages and she had been paid double and she had come back in spring and she had kept coming back because that was the thing about a place that was genuinely yours. You did not leave it because the leaving would not take. The morning was fine. The red barn gleamed. The windmill turned against the sky. The wheat in the south field moved in the breeze that came from the northwest, and the border collie Dell lay in a patch of early sun at the edge of the yard, and from inside the house came the sound of the household awake and moving, James's voice, Clara's quicker one, Samuel's measured response to something, and the smell of the morning's bread already rising. Roscoe came out to the porch with 2 cups of coffee and handed her one, and stood beside her looking at his wheat, his farm, his land. "Good morning," he said. "Good morning," she said. She took her coffee. The sun was well up and the day was beginning the way all days began here, with work to be done and people to do it with, and the particular generous light of the Kansas morning falling on everything equally. It was enough. It was, in every sense that mattered, more than enough. It was everything.